All right, my friends, we are going to take a look at pens, printing, religion, and politics. In the Renaissance and Reformation, I call it men's with pens. Although there were some non-men certainly doing writing, even being published, even having an influence, toward the end I might leave that on you to find out a bit more about it. Should explain in class already. You've got a format for taking notes on these. You'll see the PowerPoint slides as they go through. As always, you want to avoid simply typing word for word 100% because you're not processing, you're not thinking about it. You want to do this quickly and efficiently. Use incomplete sentences, bullet points, slashes. You want basically to A, save time, and B, to be able to process the information so you say, how could I write this in a way that captures everything but isn't simply going word to word? And if you're doing that, you're probably going to understand the stuff better. Should be obvious. Please do not ask a friend, I like didn't do it or something. Send me yours. Don't worry. I'll change some words. A, you learn nothing. B, it is dishonest. And C, you might not change a lot of words when you have problems. So do your own of this. This will probably be a 20-minute long video lecture. And you know what? My guess is you could do 10 minutes one day, 10 minutes the next. Beautiful. You're ready to go. Don't forget the questions at the end, at least a couple, in which something that you didn't understand, something you'd like to know more about, or a thought that you had, something more open-ended. Do we think that? And that's great. So just anything that shows me you're engaging with it. All right, men's with pens. These are some of the folks we're looking at. One, Martin Luther, we would have already looked at by the time, at least if it's 2024, that you had seen this, so I won't spend a lot of time with him. I won't spend a lot of time with a few, in particular Petrarch, simply because he is considered to be sort of the first of the Renaissance true humanist writers. I don't know much about him, to be honest with you. Dante Alighieri is also around that time period as well, but he's often called the first humanist. He was not simply writing proofs of God's existence, but he was writing about what it meant to be a human being. He was writing love poetry. He was showing his curiosity about things. And also, they say the first tourist, there's no such thing, but that's a really common thing for folks today is, oh my God, it seems so cool. I'd love to go to Nepal, as I just did over this last break, and because it would be interesting. That's not really what people did at this time period. Petrarch did this. Jan Hus will look at, Lorenzo Valla, Niccolo Machiavelli, Baldassarre. If I ever have a second child, his name will be Baldassarre, no doubt about it, because I am Baldaziger. Okay, and Sir Thomas More, and as mentioned, Martin Luther. So I'll focus probably on 2 or 3 of these. Jan Hus, he was a Czechoslovakia, modern-day Czech Republic, called Bohemia at the time, capital city Prague. I don't know a ton about him in terms of original writing, but he had this crazy idea. I am going to translate the Bible into the Czech language. Kind of a good idea, right? Why would he do this? Because this is the Word of God, and people should be able to read the Word of God. I'm not really seeing an issue here. The Catholic Church, which was completely dominant in Western Europe at this point, Catholic Church was very clear. The Bible will be printed and read entirely in Latin. And that's it. Because that's the original language of Jesus? No, Jesus didn't speak Latin. So that's all wrong to begin with. It probably boiled down to a power play. Because after all, if you want to know what the truth is about God and the universe from a Catholic point of view, and if you wanted to get into heaven, you had to follow what's in the Bible. How do you find out what's the Bible? You better stay in good with the church because you can't find out without this. Latin is a dead language by this. 99 point whatever percent of Europeans don't speak Latin at all. It is an academic language used by priests. Well, Jan Hus believed that the power of the Catholic Church was too much and that good God-fearing Christians should be able to read for themselves what's in the Bible. Not acceptable. He was put on trial for heresy, for blaspheming against God and the church, and was burned at the stake for this. He was, by the way, not the first European to attempt to translate. A guy named John Wycliffe in Britain a little bit earlier escaped with his life. Jan Hus does not. So it gives you an idea of the control that the church had at this point. I only use this, we've certainly talked about Leonardo da Vinci, but this for me encapsulates perfectly the point of view or the general viewpoint of Renaissance era thinkers. Anybody who conducts an argument by appealing to authority is not using his intelligence, he's just using his memory. And I want you to maybe stop for a moment. Put a pause on the button and say, what's Leonardo trying to say? You might even go a step further. Do you think Leonardo is born well after Jan Hus's death? You probably knew about Jan Hus's story. Do you think that Leonardo would have been on the side of Jan Hus or the Catholic Church? I'll let you think about that for a moment. May talk about it in class. Inventions, huge. By the way, you could say a little bit earlier, I think it was around 1440 that the first of Gutenberg's printing presses was developed. It's 1455. There are different dates for it, like when it really started to make a difference. This was a movable type printing press. Now, something you probably don't need to know for this class, but Chinese hadn't developed this a few hundred years before. Here's the problem with Chinese. How many letters in the English alphabet? And if you said 38, you're wrong. It's 26. And you knew that. You knew that. Chinese is pictographic. Chinese does not use an alphabet. I mean, you see it transliterated into English, but Mandarin writing has something like 2,000 or 3,000 separate symbols, pictographs. And, to be fluent in reading Chinese, you have to memorize thousands of these things. Now, there were advantages to printing. Rather than doing it by hand, you could take metal and mold it into hundreds or even thousands of different pictograms. You could place them on a sheet of paper, add ink, roll paper over it, and then you could do that a bunch of times. But think how much more advantageous it is in English, because there are only 26 letters. So what Gutenberg was the first to be able to do in Europe, he was German, you can tell by the name, I think from eastern part of today's Germany. And Mainz, actually that's Western. Mainz, I believe, is the city he was in, near Frankfurt. What he was able to do is get a system where there are thousands of little A's, thousands of little B's, thousands of little C's, they're just made up, etc. And then you simply arrange them. I, N, T, H, E, B-E-G-I-N-N-I-N-G. There was, and you do this. Now that takes a while to do. It takes a while to make the individual letters. It certainly takes time to arrange them on the paper. But once you've done that, you can make tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of copies of that one page, and then do it again with the next page. Is it as efficient as printing from the school printer here? It is not, but compared to the old days where if you wanted a copy of a book, you had to find one of the very few literate people in Europe, usually a priest or a monk, and had to pay him an incredible amount of time to spend a year or two or more of his life copying down every single word in the book. And you'd pay him an incredible amount of money. If you had a 10-book library, you were one of the wealthiest people in Europe. Well, think about here. It takes a while to make these things, and you know what? Hundreds or thousands of books. Real important, when was Jan Hus executed? I looked this up. There is no existing copy of Jan Hus's translated Czech Bible. Why would that be? Because the church would have destroyed them. He might have made one copy, maybe spent the time making a second copy, wasn't that hard to get rid of. After the printing press, if Jan Hus had been writing even 50, 80, 90, 100 years later, he could have easily, not easily, it was tricky, but he could have found a way to make hundreds or thousands of copies. And you're going to see with Martin Luther, or you've already seen with Martin Luther, why that makes such a big difference. Impact, stop for a minute, stop the film and just say, wait a minute, why would this matter? Okay, I've come back after you paused. And there are a whole bunch of things. I mean, first of all, the spread of information, scientific information. Oh, information about exploration. Because as you might know, it was about 40, 50 years later that Europeans started going across the Atlantic, finding that the Americas were there, making major trips to Asia, which is absolutely going to change the world. And now it's not just stories, word of mouth. People are able to read accounts of these things. Shipping technology, how do you make your own compass? You could print up a manual and make hundreds or thousands of copies. It led to more literacy. It led to the spread of new ideas. Because remember our buddy Martin Luther? When did he publish his 95 Theses? You remember? 1517, a century after Jan Hus. Well, you'd better believe when he pounded that revolutionary document on the door of the church fathers just came and ripped it off, right? This is terrible. He had lots of other copies because there was a printing press. Nate Silver, who's a famous statistician, has argued, as much as we talk about how the internet has changed humankind like nothing else, he says, you know what, I would make an argument. The printing press in the 1400s, starting at that point, had a bigger impact upon the world than the internet today. Maybe, but major, major impact. Yeah, and this is where you see, we'll take a look at it. What is it saying? Remember with these things, what do you want to look at? You want to look at titles and little details, the spread of printing. Dates indicate the first occurrence of printing, and you see it here in Mainz in 1550, and that's Gutenberg around that time, spreading throughout what we think of as Germany and France today. A little bit later to the UK, it's farther away. Notice you're seeing throughout most of Europe in this area in the next 50 years. So yeah, this is a world changer for sure. That's actually Gutenberg's Bible, what it looked like, very hard to read today, a model of the press. And one of my very favorite things in history is the Wicked Bible. And I will let you take a moment at this and see why this was so evil or wicked. All right, did you get this? This is the 10 Commandments. Honor thy father and thy mother above all else. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. But what does this one say right here in yellow? Thou shalt commit adultery. What does adultery mean? It's doing something naughty with somebody who is not your husband or wife. This was a typo. Somebody left out the N-O-T, probably by accident, but I like to think that there was a sneaky guy that wanted to get away with it. That's probably what I would have done at the time. But that's just me. That's just me. So it's known today as the Wicked Bible. And again, there are hundreds, thousands of copies of it made, and oops. Anyway, I like that. That amuses me. Lorenzo Valla, one of my very favorites. Valla is fun. He was an historian, and you know how much I like historians and history teachers. Going back on this a little bit, the Catholic Church had been saying for about 1,000 years, all Christian lands, all Western Christian lands eventually, as some of you know, Eastern and Western Christian Church split in the 11th century. We talk about Orthodox Christianity. The Catholic Church to this day says it's a part of the Christian world and they'll come back to us, but that has not happened in 1,000 years and may well not happen. But the Catholic Church had said, look, in this debate between church and state. Now, you remember the walk to Canossa? We talked about that earlier, where I think it was Emperor King Henry said, I will decide who the bishops are in my land because I'm the emperor. And the Pope said, no, you even think about doing that, I will kick you out of the church. And the poor emperor was so terrified by losing his point in the church that he walked across the Alps and begged for forgiveness. That suggested a very powerful church and a state that wasn't very powerful. One of the things, and I believe that's in the 11th century, although I don't have the date in front of me, like 1060s or something like that. I could be wrong, One of the reasons the church said we're all powerful is that the great Emperor Constantine, back in the 4th century, that's in the 300s, He voluntarily, if my beautiful face weren't covering this up right now, you would actually see a nice image of this. Unfortunately, you can't see it. But the Emperor Constantine said, "The church is all powerful. The church is all holy. I formally sign over all land to the church with the understanding that the church will allow me and other wealthy nobles to use the land. But at the end of the day, it all belongs to the church. All hail the Pope." Well, Lorenzo Valla was a humanist thinker. He was a writer and a poet and a scientist, one of these Renaissance men that could just sort of do everything. And because the Renaissance was about thinking, and as Leonardo said, not just memorizing, but thinking about things, he said, I gotta wonder about this donation of Constantine. Did this really happen? Remember that the church was already somewhat weaker. The Crusades had not been successful in the 11s and 1200s, and that weakened the church. The bubonic plague absolutely tore apart Europe and made people really question what was the church effectively doing. There was concerns about the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire that was starting to move into Europe at this point. The church by the 15th century is still very powerful, and virtually everybody at this point in Europe was a loyal Christian, although some started to at least doubt the church, if not the truth of the truth of religion and the Bible, although I think there were some. Leonardo, many would have argued, was an agnostic, somebody who really expressed some doubts about the belief of whether there in fact was a God or not. But listen, Leonardo would not say this publicly. But Lorenzo Valla, who is a Christian, I believe in the Word of God, didn't buy this particular document, again, in which the emperors and the common people of Europe gave all land to the church, so the church is all powerful. So rather than just arguing, or rather just going along with it, the easiest thing to do, as people have been doing for 1,000 years, or just saying, no, I think that's stupid, like, I don't believe that, well, that doesn't mean very much. He started looking at it very closely in a scholarly way, and he realized some of the language that was used, some of the vocabulary, man, those words did not exist in the 300s, more likely came about in the 8 to 900s. He started looking at it and said, wait a minute, they're talking about this city with many, many people. Look, I've looked back at old records in the Romans. That city did not exist, and there certainly weren't 40,000 people in it. You know what? Not until about the 9th century. Hey, let's take a look at the document. This type of paper, this type of ink, well, that was all invented in the 800s. What do you think Lorenzo Valla's conclusion was? And if you think it's that this is a forgery, it's something that the church made up in the 900s, ding, 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 A for the day. And I will let you just stop the film for a sec. We can talk about this in class. So what? So this is a forgery. Who cares? It makes difference. Absolutely makes difference. We'll talk about that. This is a name that you might know, Niccolo Machiavelli. You might have heard the name Machiavelli, or you might have heard the adjective Machiavellian. Anybody know what Machiavellian means? Scheming, sneaky. You're going to get yours. I don't care what gets in my way. Niccolo Machiavelli, he was a writer, a government official, an early maybe political scientist, you might think of this. And he wrote a book called Il Principe, The Prince, in 1513. Now, the bigger story behind this is that like a new family had taken over Florence, and Machiavelli, who was out of a job because he worked for the old government, was trying to write this to get a position in government again. He was professional, educated professional that did not own his own land or run his own state. He was not a prince or a king, but he wanted in with this next family. He wrote this as a guidebook for rulers. How do you rule effectively? And there is some debate. Some people said that this is Machiavelli saying this is the way things should be. Others saying it was a satire. He was trying to be sarcastic about it. That's never made as much sense to me. One that is quite possible, though. Machiavelli wants to be accepted by these new powerful people. What do you want to tell people that you want to accept you? You want to tell them what they want to hear. And that is a possibility. Here was his bottom line. The ends justify the means. You, sir, you're the king, you're the prince. Your job is to stay in power. What is justified in terms of whatever will keep you in power? You need to be reasonable, you need to be logical, and you need to keep control. Now, in a perfect word, the prince, the king, is loved by his people and feared so they don't do wrong. And he certainly is not proposing kings should just go out and kill people because it's fun. He says, no, that's not going to help you keep power. People will be angry at you. But in an imperfect world, sometimes you got a choice. You can be loved or you can be feared. And he made it clear. In that case where there's a decision to be made, the king, the prince, should be feared. Stop if you can think for a moment. Stop the film and see if you can think of a reason why he would put that emphasis. It's not a moral or ethical thing. It's an effectiveness thing. It's keeping order. Well, Machiavelli, in language much more complicated than this, said, look, I can make you fear me. I can't make you love me. I could say to everybody in this class, guys, I just want to be loved by you. I'm going to give you all A pluses and bring you candy every single day. All I ask is that you love me. And you know what? You might tell me to my face that, oh, yes, we love you, Ziegler. Well, what are you going to say at home? That pathetic guy, he's so insecure. He's desperate for love and affection. He's just going to give away grades. What a loser. I can't make you love me. Can I make you fear me? I show up, I hold a gun to your head and say, do your homework. You're going to do your homework. You don't love me. You don't like it. You're going to do this. What he's getting at is that the leader, the ruler, the prince, the king can control whether or not people are afraid of them, but he can't control how they feel about them. So if you've got a choice, fear first, love and goodwill second. And again, this is something, 500 years later, this is still debated. We're living in a world that seems to be moving back toward autocracies and dictatorial control in many countries around the world. I don't know, it's not the kind of thing that I like, but Machiavelli's ideas are not dead, and hence the idea of Machiavellian maneuvers. Ken Baldessari, I will name my child Baldessari for sure. He wrote a book called Il Cortigiano. I'm sure I said that horribly. I hope we have no Italian speakers. My God, we do. I'm going to be laughed at. The book of the courtier. The courtier is the gentleman who is at the court. And it was a book of manners. That's what it was. How does a gentleman live? Well, first of all, they must come from noble birth. You can't just be a street slumming scumbag type. No, you must be a gentleman like I. It's not just a matter of doing one thing well. Hey, you know what? The Renaissance man. Da Vinci's probably the greatest example. He was an artist, he was a sculptor, he was a writer, he was an athlete, he was an architect, a scientist. That's the idea. A gentleman should be adept and strong in as many ways as possible, multifaceted. You would not find Baldessari Castiglione saying, oh, are you a math person or are you an English person? No, you are both. Oh, are you an athlete or a scholar? No, you're both. So that's the goal behind it. And it really is. It's a book of manners. And it's kind of bridging the gaps. The valor, the strengths of the knights on the horses fighting these mighty men, and the genius and the learnedness of the Renaissance humanist. That's Baldessari Castiglione and The Courtier, Cortigiano, rules for how gentlemen should live. You might notice, by the way, everybody we've talked to about so far, what impact do you think any of this has on the common person, the peasant, the poor person? The answer is, during the Renaissance, nothing. Really nothing. I mean, look, these are not roles for somebody who is a peasant, who is knee-deep in mud and muck 365 days a year trying to scrape out a living. Questions about whether the donation of Constantine was legitimate or a forgery. You know what, for 98% of Europeans, they just want to be eating something next week. So the Renaissance is very much a movement of the elite. You start seeing later changes you'll get to next year in your 7th grade class that are definitely affecting more and more people. Real quick on this one, you notice I've got a little video here, so I'm just going to show you this in class. But this is a novel. If you ever hear the word utopia, what does that mean? It means the perfect world, a perfect place. It's actually a pun, because you means not a place. This is a place that doesn't exist. Thomas More, who was a Catholic Church member, and eventually, by the way, executed by King Henry VIII in England. Yes, he was. He wrote a book about the perfect world. And you know what? That perfect world, there is no individual holding of wealth. We all share equally. It's a made-up story of an island that exists somewhere, and of course it did not, in which people were absolutely equal, cooperating, etc., etc., etc. Again, I'll show you the little vid in class. Martin Luther, already talked about him, but again, if we're talking about men's with pens, his 95 Theses, again, I don't think we need to go into any more detail about Martin Luther, but I just thought it was a good idea to actually place it here because it's part of this. And then finally, a look, you know, the Renaissance, when you think about the Renaissance, you think, oh, Italy, 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 or the Italian city-states, as it were. If you were in an older class, this were an AP European history course, we would mention that there was a so-called Northern Renaissance as well. And there is Northern style art. We've looked at Hieronymus Bosch, his Garden of Earthly Delights, for example, a Northern painter. And there was also a way that it was somewhat different. Just, I'm going to mention these names just so you can file them away and say, oh, I've heard of that dude, but we won't do much more with that. So Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a book called The Canterbury Tales. It is about a whole bunch of folks from different backgrounds traveling across Europe to go see these holy relics, go on pilgrimages, etc. Christian version of the Hajj, I suppose, but not as formal as that. Yeah, again, lengthy, one of the first great English language or sort of English language novels. Erasmus of Rotterdam, I won't even touch on him. It's a little bit questioning. He is interesting, though, is that you'll notice that this is during Luther's Reformation. He was also a major, major, major critic of the Catholic Church. But when push came to shove, he stayed with the Catholic Church and did not become a Protestant with Luther, but won't deal with him. Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, you've certainly heard of, one of the great playwrights of all time. I have a hard time understanding what's going on in a lot of his, but I have seen a couple good productions where it kind of comes to life. And I mentioned Miguel Cervantes, and you might know the name Don Quixote. Don Quixote and his donkey that, I don't know. I'm only including these just because they were on a slide for some older students. I thought, you know what, it never hurts to at least hear names, and then 5 years down the line you read, hey, Cervantes, Don Quixote, I've heard of that. Might strike your curiosity. Okay, got it in about a half an hour. So again, you should have your notes-taking template out. Maybe you've already started. Go back and just get what you think is vital about these things. You do not want to capture every single thing here. You do not want to just type word for word what you would see on the screen, but you want to be able to, let's say you look at your notes, you put it away for a month, you take them out. Could you spend 5 minutes going over those notes and say, you know what, I understand who these people were and why they're important. And if you're saying, you know what, I really wouldn't, I've got some names and some words, but I don't know if I know what it means, you want to go back and do a better job of it. Okay, don't forget your couple questions at the end for the class, and I will be seeing you soon.